The music had not even reached its peak when Elena Marsh felt a hand close around her wrist. She turned, ready to pull away, and found herself looking into a pair of gray eyes that seemed to judge her before he had said a single word. The stranger was tall, dressed in black and silver, and he wore his good looks like a weapon. "You are standing in the wrong place," he said, his voice low and flat. "This corner is reserved for guests who matter." Elena blinked. For a moment, she thought she had misheard him over the noise of the orchestra. Around them, candles floated in the air, held up by threads of pale light, and silk gowns swept across the marble floor like colored water. She had never seen anything like the Grand Unity Ball before tonight, and she had spent the last hour trying not to feel out of place. Now this stranger had found the exact words to make her feel smaller than she already did. "I did not realize corners had owners," she said, keeping her tone even. "They do tonight." His gaze moved over her dress, the simple blue fabric she had sewn herself, and something like amusement flickered across his face. "That is a servant stitching. Did you borrow it, or did someone take pity on you?" The words landed harder than she expected. Elena had spent 3 nights finishing that dress, cutting the fabric by candlelight after her shop closed, adding small silver beads along the collar, because she could not afford anything finer. She had been proud of it when she left home. Now she felt the heat rise in her face. "I made it myself," she said. "Unlike most people here, I know how to use my hands for something besides holding a glass of wine." A few nearby guests turned to look. The stranger's jaw tightened, but instead of backing away, he stepped closer, lowering his voice so that only she could hear. "A common girl with a sharp tongue," he said. "How did you even get an invitation to this ball? Did you steal it, or did you seduce someone at the gate?" That was the moment Elena stopped thinking and started moving. Her palm connected with his cheek before she even decided to raise her hand, a sharp crack that cut through the music and silenced the closest circle of guests. The sound seemed to hang in the air far longer than it should have. For a heartbeat, nobody moved. The stranger's head had turned slightly from the force of the slap, and when he looked back at her, his eyes had gone from cold to something far more dangerous. Elena's heart pounded so hard she could hear it in her own ears. She realized, too late, that every eye in the hall was now on the two of them. "You dare," someone whispered from the crowd, though whether it was directed at her or at him, she could not tell. Guards in silver armor began pushing through the crowd, their boots striking the marble floor in sharp, urgent steps. Elena's stomach dropped. She had not thought, not for a second, about who this man might be. She had only thought about the insult, about the dress she had worked so hard on, about the years of being told she was not good enough for rooms like this one. Now 4 armed men were closing in on her, and the stranger she had struck was watching her with an expression she could not read. "Seize her," one of the guards said, reaching for her arm. "No." The single word cut through the tension like a blade. It came from the stranger, and it stopped the guards instantly, their hands falling back to their sides, as if the command had physical weight. Elena stared at him, confused. He rubbed his jaw slowly, and for the first time since he had approached her, something like true interest crossed his face. "Leave her," he said again, quieter this time, though his voice still carried across the sudden silence. "I asked for this." The crowd began to murmur, a wave of whispers spreading outward from where they stood. Elena caught fragments of words she did not understand. Someone said, "The king," in a hushed, frightened tone. Someone else said, "Impossible," and a servant girl. She turned her head, searching for whoever they meant, before the truth settled over her like cold water. They meant him. She looked back at the stranger, really looked at him this time, past the anger and the shame that had clouded her vision moments before. The silver embroidery on his coat was not decoration. It was the mark of the royal house. The ring on his hand, plain and unremarkable at first glance, bore the crest of the wolf crown. Every guard in the hall had responded to his voice as if it were law, because it was. "You," she whispered, "you're the king." "King Draven," he confirmed, and there was no humor in his voice now, only something sharp and watchful. "You struck the Alpha King of this realm, in front of 300 witnesses." Elena felt the floor tilt beneath her feet. She had heard the stories, the same as everyone else in the kingdom. The Alpha King who ruled with an iron will, who had not taken a mate in the 6 years since his coronation, despite the pressure from every noble house. The king who was said to be cold enough to freeze a room simply by entering it. She had imagined him as an older man, gray at the temples, surrounded by advisors. She had never imagined he would be the arrogant stranger who had mocked her dress only minutes ago. "I did not know," she said, and her voice came out smaller than she wanted it to. "You should have told me who you were before you insulted my sewing." A ripple of shocked laughter passed through the nearest guests, quickly smothered when Draven's gaze swept over them. He turned back to Elena, and for a long moment he said nothing at all, simply studying her face, as though he were trying to solve a puzzle only he could see. "What is your name?" he asked finally. "Elena. Elena Marsh." "Elena Marsh." He repeated it slowly, testing the shape of it. "Do you know what happens to those who raise a hand against the crown?" She swallowed hard, aware that every person in that ballroom was waiting to hear his answer, as much as she was. She thought of her mother, waiting at home, who had begged her not to go to the ball at all. She thought of the small shop she ran, the one that barely kept them fed some months, and wondered if she would ever see it again. "I imagine it is nothing pleasant," she said, lifting her chin, despite the fear pooling in her chest. "But you called my dress a servant's stitching, and you accused me of things I did not do. I would slap you again, if you said the same words twice." For a moment, Draven simply stared at her. Then, to the disbelief of everyone watching, the corner of his mouth curved upward, not quite a smile, but close enough to unsettle the entire room. "Interesting," he murmured, more to himself than to her. He turned to the guards, who were still standing frozen, unsure whether to act or retreat. "Let her go. This matter is finished for tonight." "Your Majesty," one of the guards began, clearly troubled by the order. "She struck you in public. The court will expect." "I know what the court expects," Draven said, his tone leaving no room for argument. "I am telling you what will happen instead." The guard bowed his head and stepped back, though his confusion was plain on his face. Around the hall, the whispers grew louder, spreading from guest to guest like fire through dry grass. Elena stood frozen at the center of it all, unsure whether she had just escaped punishment or walked into something far more complicated. Draven studied her once more, his gray eyes moving from her face to the small silver beads on her collar, the ones she had sewn on with trembling hands 3 nights ago. Something in his expression shifted, though she could not name what it was. "You should go home, Elena Marsh," he said quietly, "before I change my mind." She did not need to be told twice. Gathering the edges of her blue dress, she turned and walked as steadily as she could manage through the parting crowd, feeling every eye follow her toward the doors. Her hands shook the entire way, though she kept her chin high, until she was finally outside, breathing in the cool night air, her heart hammering against her ribs. Behind her, inside the golden light of the ballroom, King Draven remained exactly where she had left him, one hand still resting against the cheek she had struck. His advisor, an older wolf named Cassian, appeared at his side, his face tight with concern. "My king," Cassian said carefully, "the entire court saw what happened. Word of this will spread across every pack in the kingdom by morning." "Let it spread," Draven said, his eyes fixed on the doors through which Elena had disappeared. "You could have had her thrown into the dungeons. Instead, you protected her. The nobles will ask why." Draven's expression grew distant, as though he were listening to something only he could hear, some pull beneath his skin that had nothing to do with the ballroom or the watching crowd. He had felt it the moment he first approached her, before he had even opened his mouth to speak, a recognition so sudden and complete that it had unsettled him enough to say cruel things he did not entirely mean. "Because, Cassian," he said slowly, "she is the reason I came to this ball in the first place." Cassian's eyebrows rose, but before he could ask what his king meant, Draven had already turned and walked toward the private hall that led back to his chambers, leaving the ballroom buzzing with questions that no one dared ask aloud. Outside, unaware of the storm she had just left behind her, Elena hurried through the palace gardens toward the road home, her thoughts a tangled mess of fear, anger, and something she refused to name. She did not look back at the palace once. If she had, she might have seen the king standing at a high window, watching her small figure grow smaller in the moonlight, already certain that their story was only just beginning. The summons arrived 3 days later. carried by a royal messenger on a white horse that drew the attention of every neighbor on Elena's street. She was standing behind the counter of her small tailoring shop, a needle between her fingers, when the messenger stepped through the door and unrolled a scroll bearing the royal seal. "Elena Marsh," he announced, his voice formal and clipped. "You are summoned to the palace, by order of His Majesty, King Draven. You are to appear before sundown." The shop went silent. Elena's mother, seated near the window mending a torn sleeve, dropped her sewing into her lap, her face draining of color. Word of what had happened at the ball had already reached their small town, twisted and reshaped a dozen times by gossip, until Elena barely recognized the story herself. Some said she had attacked the king with a knife. Others said she had been dragged away in chains. The truth, that she had slapped him, and then simply walked out of the palace unharmed, seemed too strange for anyone to believe. "This is it," her mother whispered once the messenger had gone. "They are going to punish you properly this time." "Maybe," Elena said, though her stomach twisted painfully at the thought. "Or maybe he wants to finish the argument himself." She did not feel nearly as calm as she sounded. That afternoon, she changed into her plainest dress, the one without silver beads or careful stitching, reasoning that if she was about to face punishment, she would rather not lose another good dress in the process. Her mother wanted to come with her, but Elena refused, unwilling to let anyone else be pulled into whatever trouble she had caused. The carriage sent for her was far grander than anything she had ever ridden in, its seats lined with deep green cushions, and the ride to the palace felt both too short and impossibly long. By the time the gates came into view, her hands were trembling in her lap, and she pressed them flat against her knees to keep them still. She was led not to a throne room or a dungeon, as she had feared, but to a quiet study, lined with tall bookshelves, and warmed by a low fire. Draven stood near the window, his back to her, his hands clasped behind him. He did not turn immediately when the doors closed behind her, leaving Elena standing alone in the middle of the room, unsure whether she should speak first or wait for him to acknowledge her. "You came," he said finally, still facing the window. "I was summoned by the king," she replied carefully. "I did not think refusing was an option." He turned then, and she was struck again by how different he looked away from the noise and light of the ballroom. Without the crowd watching, without the weight of the crown pressing visibly on his shoulders, he seemed almost ordinary, though his eyes still held the same sharp intelligence that had unsettled her 3 nights before. "I owe you an explanation," he said, gesturing toward a chair near the fire. "Sit, please." Elena hesitated, then lowered herself onto the edge of the chair, her posture stiff and cautious. Draven remained standing, choosing his words with obvious care. "What I am about to tell you will sound strange," he began. "Among our kind, there is a bond called the fated mark. It is rare. Most wolves live their entire lives without ever encountering it. When it happens, it cannot be explained through logic or reason. It is simply recognized, the moment 2 people are near enough to sense it." "I have heard the stories," Elena said slowly. "Old tales meant to frighten children into behaving, or to comfort lonely hearts. I did not think they were real." "They are real," Draven said. "I felt it the moment I stepped into that ballroom. Before I ever approached you, before I said a single word, I already knew you were the one I had been searching for, whether I wanted to be searching or not." Elena stared at him, certain she had misunderstood. "You mean to tell me," she said slowly, "that you insulted my dress, mocked my hands, and accused me of theft, because you recognized me as your fated mate?" A flicker of something like embarrassment crossed his face, quickly replaced by his usual composure. "I did not handle it well," he admitted. "I have spent 6 years avoiding this exact situation. Every noble family in the kingdom has tried to place their daughters in front of me, hoping I might choose one of them. I have grown accustomed to treating every stranger at court with suspicion. When I felt the pull toward you, my first instinct was not warmth, it was resistance. So you insulted me instead." "I tested you," he corrected, though even he seemed to hear how weak the excuse sounded. "I wanted to see whether you were like the rest of them, chasing status and title. Instead, you slapped me in front of the entire court." Despite herself, Elena felt the corner of her mouth twitch. "You deserved it." "I know," he said, and there was no anger in his voice this time, only something close to reluctant respect. "That is precisely why I stopped the guards. No noblewoman in this kingdom would have dared to strike me, no matter what I said to her. You did not hesitate. Elena studied him for a long moment, trying to reconcile the cold stranger from the ballroom with the man standing before her now, quieter and more thoughtful than she would have believed possible 3 days earlier. What happens now? She asked. Am I meant to simply accept that I am your fated mate and move into the palace, as though my entire life did not exist before this? No, Draven said firmly. I would not ask that of you. Not yet. The bond does not obligate either of us to act on it immediately. Many mates choose to build trust first, to understand one another before making any formal claim. He paused, watching her carefully. What I am asking is smaller. I would like you to remain near the palace, under a position that will not draw unwanted attention. My royal seamstress recently retired, and the position remains open. Elena blinked. You want me to work as your seamstress? It would allow us to see one another, to speak, without forcing either of us into a decision neither of us is ready to make, he said. You would keep your independence, you would be paid fairly, and protected. And I would not need to explain to the entire court why the woman who struck me in front of 300 witnesses has disappeared entirely from their gossip. Despite the strangeness of the offer, Elena found herself considering it seriously. Her family's shop had struggled for years, barely covering their expenses through the winter months, and a position within the palace, however unusual its origins, would ease that burden considerably. And beneath the fear and confusion still tangled inside her, there was something else. A small, curious thread pulling her toward this man and the mystery he represented. A feeling she did not entirely trust, but could not fully dismiss either. If I refuse, she said carefully, what happens? Nothing, Draven said. You return home, and I do not summon you again. The bond does not disappear, but I will not force anything upon you that you do not choose freely. His honesty surprised her more than anything else he had said. She had expected pressure, perhaps even threats disguised as royal courtesy. Instead, he was offering her a choice, plainly and without manipulation, something she had not expected from a king, with a reputation for coldness. I will need time to speak with my mother, she said finally. And I will need to know that my shop, and the customers who depend on it, will not suffer while I am away. Both can be arranged, Draven said, and for the first time since she had entered the room, something like relief passed across his face, quickly hidden, but not quickly enough to escape her notice. Take whatever time you need to decide. I am in no position to demand anything else from you. Elena rose from the chair, steadier now than when she had entered, though her mind remained a storm of questions. As she turned to leave, Draven spoke once more, his voice softer than before. For what it is worth, he said, I am sorry for what I said to you at the ball. You did not deserve it, regardless of what I felt, or why I felt it. She paused at the door, glancing back at him. Apology accepted, she said, though I still think you deserved the slap. This time, when the corner of his mouth lifted, it was closer to a real smile than anything she had seen from him before, and Elena left the palace that evening, with far more to consider than she had expected when the messenger first arrived at her shop that morning. Elena's mother listened to the entire story in silence, her hands folded tightly in her lap, her eyes never leaving her daughter's face. When Elena finished explaining the offer, the fated bond, the position as royal seamstress, the quiet study warmed by firelight, her mother let out a long breath and shook her head slowly. A king who insults you, then offers you a job sewing his robes, she said. This is either the strangest kindness I have ever heard of, or the beginning of real trouble. Perhaps both, Elena admitted. In the end, it was practicality that decided the matter more than romance or curiosity. The wages Draven offered would clear the debt on their shop within a single season, and the protection of the crown, however strange its origin, was not something easily dismissed in a kingdom where lower packs often struggled against the whims of stronger ones. A week later, Elena packed a single trunk and moved into the modest quarters set aside for palace staff, close enough to the royal wing to be summoned easily, far enough to maintain a measure of privacy she was grateful for. Her days quickly fell into a rhythm. Mornings were spent in the sewing rooms, surrounded by bolts of fine fabric far beyond anything she had worked with before, silk imported from distant shores, thread spun with silver, buttons carved from polished bone. She altered ceremonial robes, mended tears in ancient tapestries, and slowly earned the grudging respect of the other palace seamstresses, who had expected a favored outsider, and instead found a woman who worked harder than any of them. Draven, for his part, kept his distance at first, true to his word that he would not pressure her. But distance in a palace as small as this one proved difficult to maintain. They crossed paths in hallways, in gardens, in the quiet library where Elena sometimes retreated during her free hours to read books she never could have afforded on her own. Each encounter began the same way, with careful, formal words, and ended, more often than not, with something closer to real conversation. "You are frowning at that book as though it has personally offended you," Draven said one afternoon, finding her curled into a window seat in the library, a heavy volume balanced on her knees. "It is a history of the Northern Pax," Elena said, without looking up. "The author clearly believes every conflict in the last 200 years was caused entirely by women who refused to marry the men chosen for them. An unpopular opinion, even among scholars," Draven said, settling into the chair across from her, close enough that she finally raised her eyes to meet his. "I take it you disagree." "I disagree that women bear the blame for wars started by men too proud to accept rejection," she said pointedly. "Though perhaps that is a controversial position to hold in front of a king." "I am something of an authority on pride," Draven admitted, a rare flicker of self-deprecating humor crossing his face. "I have been accused of it more than once." "Only once, that I witnessed personally," Elena said. "Though I imagine the accusation has been made many times before." Their conversations had a particular rhythm to them, quick exchanges that danced along the edge of teasing, without quite tipping into open flirtation, though the pull between them grew harder to ignore with each meeting. Elena found herself looking forward to these encounters more than she wanted to admit, and she noticed, too, the way Draven's schedule seemed to bring him past the sewing rooms, far more often than royal business could reasonably require. Not everyone at court shared her growing ease within the palace walls. Lady Seraphine, daughter of one of the kingdom's oldest and most powerful noble houses, had spent years positioning herself as the most likely candidate for queen, cultivating alliances among the court's most influential families, and cementing her place at every royal gathering Draven attended. The sudden appearance of an unknown seamstress, rumored to have struck the king himself and somehow escaped punishment, threatened everything Seraphine had worked toward. Elena first encountered her properly nearly a month after moving into the palace, in a corridor outside the Grand Hall, where preparations were underway for an upcoming diplomatic gathering. Seraphine appeared as if from nowhere, elegant in deep crimson silk, her golden hair arranged in an intricate braid that must have taken hours to complete. "You must be the seamstress everyone is whispering about," Seraphine said, her voice pleasant on the surface, sharp underneath. "The one who struck His Majesty at the Unity Ball." "Elena Marsh," Elena said, offering a polite nod, though she felt the weight of Seraphine's scrutiny like a physical thing. "Lady Seraphine," the other woman replied, extending 2 fingers rather than a full hand. "I have heard several versions of your story. In one, you drew a blade. In another, you fainted the moment guards approached you. I confess I am curious which version, if any, is true." "I slapped him," Elena said simply. "There was no blade, and I did not faint." Something flickered across Seraphine's face, quickly smoothed away. "How refreshingly direct," she said. "Tell me, Elena Marsh, do you believe a common seamstress belongs among the halls where kings and queens conduct the business of nations?" "I believe a common seamstress belongs wherever she is offered honest work," Elena replied evenly. "Whether that troubles you is not something I can help." Seraphine's smile did not waver, though her eyes had gone cold. "How amusing," she said. "I do hope you understand your place here, whatever peculiar favor the king has shown you. Positions granted on a whim can be revoked just as easily. I would hate to see you disappointed." Before Elena could respond, Seraphine swept past her down the corridor, leaving behind the faint scent of expensive perfume and a warning that hung in the air, far longer than the words themselves. Elena stood still for a long moment, replaying the exchange, aware that she had just made an enemy, without fully understanding the shape of the danger that enemy might pose. That evening, she mentioned the encounter to Draven during one of their now familiar meetings in the garden, where he had taken to walking after his evening duties concluded. He listened with a growing frown, his jaw tightening as she described Seraphine's carefully veiled threats. "Seraphine has expected to become queen since we were children," Draven said once Elena finished. "Her family has invested years and considerable resources into that expectation. Your presence threatens everything she believes she is owed." "Should I be worried?" Elena asked, though she already suspected the answer. "You should be careful," Draven said, his voice grave. "Seraphine is not accustomed to losing, and she has never been the sort to accept disappointment gracefully. I will speak with her, but I doubt it will change much." Elena nodded slowly, watching the last light fade from the sky above the garden walls. The palace, which had begun to feel almost comfortable over the past weeks, suddenly seemed full of shadows she had not noticed before. Corners, where danger might easily hide behind polite smiles and elegant silk. She thought of Seraphine's cold eyes, her carefully chosen threats, and wondered just how far a woman raised to expect a crown might go to protect what she believed was rightfully hers. "Whatever happens," Draven said quietly, drawing her attention back to him, "I will not let anything happen to you, Elena. I know I have little right to make such promises so soon, but I intend to keep it regardless." She studied his face in the fading light, searching for the arrogance she had first encountered at the ball, and finding instead something steadier, something that had grown slowly over the past month, without either of them fully acknowledging it. She did not know yet what to call the feeling settling in her chest, but she knew, with growing certainty, that it was no longer simple curiosity that kept drawing her back to his side. "Thank you," she said softly, and for the first time since arriving at the palace, she allowed herself to believe, if only a little, that his promise might actually hold true. The royal dinner was held in honor of a visiting delegation from the Eastern Pax, a gathering meant to strengthen trade agreements that had grown fragile over the past year. Elena had not expected to attend, given her position within the palace, but Draven had insisted, wanting her present at his side as the negotiations unfolded, a small but deliberate signal to the court that her place within his life was not temporary. She wore a gown of deep green silk that evening, a gift from Draven that she had initially refused before finally accepting under his insistence that it was simply payment for her work, nothing more. The great hall glittered with candlelight, long tables set with silver and crystal, the air thick with the scent of roasted meat and spiced wine. Elena sat near the head of the table, close enough to Draven that she could feel the warmth radiating from him even across the small distance between their chairs. Seraphine sat several seats down, dressed in gold that caught the candlelight with every small movement, her expression pleasant and composed, despite the tension that had simmered between the two women since their encounter in the corridor weeks earlier. Throughout the meal, she remained polite, even charming, engaging the Eastern delegates in easy conversation, laughing at their jokes, refilling their cups with practiced grace. Elena found herself almost relaxing, wondering if perhaps she had misjudged the extent of the danger Draven had warned her about. The first course passed without incident. The second, a rich stew served in delicate porcelain bowls, arrived just as the conversation turned toward trade routes and shipping tariffs, subjects dense enough that Elena's attention began to wander toward the musicians playing softly near the far wall. She lifted her spoon, tasted the stew, and immediately noticed something wrong, a faint bitterness beneath the rich broth that did not belong there. She set the spoon down carefully, frowning, and glanced toward Draven, who was deep in conversation with the lead delegate and had not yet touched his own bowl. Before she could decide whether to say anything, a wave of dizziness swept over her, sudden and disorienting, the edges of the room blurring at the corners of her vision. "Elena?" Draven's voice reached her as though from a great distance, and she felt his hand grip her arm, just as the room tilted sharply beneath her. The last thing she registered clearly was the sound of her own bowl shattering against the marble floor, followed by a rising chorus of alarmed voices, before darkness closed in around her. She woke hours later in an unfamiliar bed, soft linens pressed against her skin, the sharp scent of medicinal herbs hanging in the air. Her head throbbed painfully, and her mouth felt dry and cracked, but she was alive, and as her vision slowly cleared, she found Draven seated in a chair beside the bed, his elbows resting on his knees, his face drawn with an exhaustion she had never seen from him before. "Elena." He was at her side instantly, his hand finding hers with a gentleness that contrasted sharply with the tension radiating from the rest of him. "Thank the moon. You are awake." "What happened?" she managed, her voice hoarse. "You were poisoned," he said, and the words came out clipped and controlled, though she could see the fury simmering just beneath the surface of his composure. The physician confirmed it within an hour. Whatever was used, it was not meant to kill quickly. It was meant to cause suffering first. Elena's stomach turned at the thought, the memory of the bitter taste beneath the stew's rich broth returning with unpleasant clarity. How long have I been asleep? 2 days, Draven said quietly. The physician did everything possible, but even now, she cannot promise you have recovered fully. You must rest, and eat only what has been personally tested, for the time being. 2 days, Elena repeated, the number settling heavily in her chest. She studied his face more closely, noting the shadows beneath his eyes, the tension held tight in his jaw. You have not slept, have you? I could not, he said simply. Not until I knew you would wake. Something in his voice, raw and unguarded in a way she had not heard from him before, made her chest ache, in a way that had nothing to do with the poison still working its way from her system. She squeezed his hand gently, and for a long moment neither of them spoke, the silence heavy with everything neither was quite ready to name aloud. Have you found who did this? She asked finally. Draven's expression darkened. Not yet. The kitchen staff have been questioned extensively, but whoever arranged this was careful. The poison was likely added after the stew left the kitchen, during the brief window when the dishes were carried to the table. I have guards reviewing every servant who had access to that hall during the meal. Seraphine, Elena said quietly, giving voice to the suspicion that had been forming in her mind since she first regained consciousness. I suspect the same, Draven admitted. But suspicion is not proof, and accusing a noblewoman of her standing without evidence would create chaos within the court, chaos her family would use against me at the worst possible moment. I will not act rashly, Elena, but I promise you, I will find the truth. Over the following days, as Elena slowly regained her strength, she watched a side of Draven emerge that she had not fully witnessed before. The cold, controlled king, who ruled with careful distance, seemed to fracture slightly around the edges, replaced by someone rawer, more determined, driven by something that went far beyond royal duty. He personally reviewed every report from his investigators. He doubled the guard rotation around her chambers. He sat with her each evening, sometimes in comfortable silence, sometimes discussing lighter matters, clearly attempting to distract her mind from the danger that still lingered somewhere within the palace walls. You did not have to do all of this, Elena told him one evening, nearly a week after the poisoning, as he adjusted the blankets around her with more care than she thought a king capable of. I did, he said simply. The moment I felt the pull toward you, my instincts changed. Protecting you is not a duty I perform out of obligation, Elena. It has become something closer to necessity. She studied him carefully in the low candlelight, searching for any trace of the arrogant stranger she had slapped at the ball, and finding instead a man who had quietly, steadily, become something far more important to her than she had ever intended to allow. I am not as fragile as this makes me appear, she said, though there was no real protest in her voice. I know, Draven said, the ghost of a smile finally softening his tired features. It does not make the fear any easier to bear. Outside the chamber walls, unseen by either of them, a servant loyal to Lady Seraphine slipped quietly through a side corridor, carrying word of Elena's recovery back to her mistress. Seraphine, seated in her private chambers, listened to the report with a tight, controlled expression, her mind already turning toward a second plan, one far less likely to fail than the first had been. The failure of the poison had not deterred her ambition. If anything, it had only sharpened it, and somewhere within the palace, the next threat against Elena Marsh was already beginning to take shape. Recovery came slowly, but it came, and by the time 2 more weeks had passed, Elena had returned to her work in the sewing rooms, though under considerably tighter watch than before. 2 guards now stood outside her chamber door at all times, a fact she found more suffocating than reassuring, though she understood well enough why Draven insisted upon it. It was during one of these quiet afternoons, threading silver needle through deep blue fabric meant for an upcoming ceremony, that Draven found her, closing the sewing room door behind him with unusual care, as though he wished to ensure no one else might overhear what he intended to say. I need to tell you something, he said, settling into the chair across from her workbench, his expression more serious than she had seen since the night of the poisoning. Something about the fated bond, and about my family, that I have not shared with anyone outside my closest advisors. Elena set down her needle, giving him her full attention. You look troubled. I am, he admitted. You deserve to understand exactly what you have become part of, Elena, before this goes any further between us. He drew a slow breath, his gaze fixed somewhere past her shoulder, as though he were looking into the past, rather than the room around them. My father was king before me, he began, a strong ruler, respected across every pack in the kingdom. When he was young, he found his fated mate, a woman from a minor house with no political power, much like your own family. What happened to her? Elena asked quietly, already sensing the answer would not be a happy one. He rejected her, Draven said, his voice flat with old, carefully buried pain. The court pressured him relentlessly, insisting a king required a queen of proper standing, someone who could strengthen alliances rather than a woman chosen by instinct alone. My father, young and afraid of disappointing the advisors who had raised him, rejected the bond and married a noblewoman instead, my mother. Elena waited in silence, sensing there was more to the story, something heavier still to come. Rejecting a fated bond carries consequences, Draven continued, not merely emotional ones. Among our kind, it is said to curse the bloodline, weakening the connection each future generation is capable of forming. My parents' marriage was cold from the beginning, a partnership built on duty rather than affection. My father grew distant as the years passed, haunted, I believe, by the choice he had made. He died believing he had failed not only the woman he rejected, but every generation that came after him. And you believe the same curse could affect you, Elena said slowly, understanding beginning to dawn. I do not know if I believe the old stories in their entirety, Draven admitted, but I watched my father's marriage crumble slowly over decades, watched the emptiness in his eyes whenever he thought no one was observing him. I swore, long before I ever expected to find my own fated mate, that I would not repeat his mistake. When I felt the pull toward you at the ball, despite every instinct telling me to resist it, to protect the throne from scandal, I made the decision immediately that I would not turn away from what I felt, whatever the political cost. Elena studied him for a long moment, absorbing the weight of what he had shared, the vulnerability in admitting a fear that had clearly shaped so much of who he had become. That is why you stopped the guards, she said slowly, not simply curiosity. You were already determined not to lose me, even before you truly knew me. Yes, Draven admitted, though I will confess, the determination has only grown stronger the more I have come to know you, rather than weaker, as I half expected it might. A warmth spread through Elena's chest at his words, something she had been resisting acknowledging fully for weeks now, ever since their conversations in the library had begun to feel less like careful diplomacy, and more like something dangerously close to genuine affection. I appreciate you telling me this, she said. It explains a great deal about the man I met that first night, and the very different man I have come to know since. I am not proud of how I approached you at the ball, Draven said. Fear made me cruel that night, though it is a poor excuse for the words I used. You have more than made up for it since, Elena said, offering him a small, genuine smile. Though I still intend to remind you of that slap whenever you grow too arrogant in the future. Draven laughed, a real laugh, unguarded and warm, in a way she had rarely heard from him, and the sound settled something uncertain in her chest, a quiet confirmation that whatever this bond between them truly was, it had grown into something she no longer wished to walk away from, curse or no curse, danger or no danger. Their conversation might have continued longer, had a sharp knock not interrupted them, followed immediately by Cassian's urgent voice through the door. Your Majesty, forgive the intrusion. There is news you must hear immediately. Draven's expression shifted instantly back into the composed, alert mask of a ruler, though Elena caught the flicker of reluctance in his eyes as he rose from the chair. Enter. Cassian stepped inside, his face grim, a folded letter clutched in his hand. We have received word from our investigators. There is evidence connecting the poison used against Lady Elena to a supplier operating out of the Southern Territories, territories controlled by House Ashgrove. Seraphine's family, Elena said quietly. The evidence remains circumstantial, Cassian cautioned, but combined with Lady Seraphine's clear motive, and the timing of the delegation dinner, it paints a troubling picture. Draven's jaw tightened. The warmth from moments earlier replaced entirely by cold, focused determination. "Bring me everything you have gathered," he said. "If House Ashgrove is truly responsible, I want proof strong enough to withstand any challenge before the full court, not merely suspicion strong enough to start a war I am not prepared to fight." Cassian bowed and departed swiftly, leaving Draven and Elena alone once more, though the earlier lightness between them had vanished, replaced by a shared understanding that whatever danger had begun at that fateful dinner was far from finished unfolding. "Whatever happens," Elena said quietly, "I do not intend to hide away and wait for the danger to pass. If Seraphine is truly behind this, I want to help uncover the truth, not simply be protected from it." Draven studied her for a long moment, clearly weighing his instinct to shield her against his growing respect for her determination. "You are not making this easy for me," he said finally, though there was no real complaint in his voice. "I never intended to," Elena replied, and despite the uncertainty hanging over them both, she felt something steady settle within her, a quiet resolve that whatever came next, she would face it standing beside him, not hidden behind him. The investigation into House Ashgrove moved carefully over the following weeks, guided by Cassian's network of quiet informants, and Draven's insistence that nothing be acted upon without solid proof. Elena, restless with the desire to help rather than simply wait within the safety of the palace walls, found her own way to contribute, one that drew on skills few at court would have expected from a seamstress. She had always possessed a sharp memory for detail, the kind that came naturally from years of matching fabric patterns, tracking measurements, and noticing small inconsistencies in a hem or seam that others might overlook entirely. When Cassian mentioned, almost in passing, that the poison used against her had been traced to a rare northern root known to grow only in a handful of locations, Elena remembered something that made her sit up sharply. "I have seen that root before," she said. "Pressed and dried, tucked among fabric samples delivered from the southern trading routes, it arrived with a shipment of silk meant for Lady Seraphine's personal wardrobe several weeks before the delegation dinner." Cassian's eyes widened with sudden interest. "Are you certain?" "I catalog every fabric delivery that passes through the sewing rooms," Elena said. "It is tedious work, but it means I remember things others might dismiss as unimportant. The root was pressed flat between two panels of silk, likely meant to preserve it during transport. I assumed at the time it was simply an unusual packing method." This single detail, small as it seemed, gave the investigation the thread it needed to pull the entire conspiracy into clearer focus. Cassian's informants confirmed that the silk shipment had originated not from House Ashgrove directly, but from a merchant house, with quiet ties to a rival pack from beyond the northern border, one that had long resented Draven's refusal to grant them expanded trading rights within the kingdom. "It is larger than Seraphine alone," Draven said grimly, once Cassian presented the full picture during a private meeting in his study, Elena seated beside him, rather than dismissed to the sewing rooms as court protocol might have suggested. "Someone within that northern pack is using Seraphine's ambition as a tool, feeding her resources and opportunity, in exchange for destabilizing my reign from within." "Why would she agree to such an arrangement?" Elena asked. "Surely she understands the danger of aligning herself with outside forces against the crown." "Ambition rarely considers danger clearly," Draven said. "Seraphine has spent her entire life believing the throne belonged to her by right. If foreign allies offered to help secure that outcome, I suspect she convinced herself the arrangement was simply practical, rather than treasonous." Cassian cleared his throat carefully. "There is more, Your Majesty. Our informants suggest the Northern Pact does not intend to stop with Lady Elena. Their true goal appears to be destabilizing the succession entirely, removing any possibility of a strong, unified heir to your throne. If they cannot eliminate Lady Elena quietly, they may attempt something bolder." The words settled heavily over the room. Elena felt Draven's hand find hers beneath the table, his grip firm and grounding despite the tension radiating from him. "What would you have me do?" Elena asked quietly, addressing Cassian directly. "I have no interest in remaining a target hidden away in the sewing rooms while others determine my fate around me. We need proof strong enough to expose Seraphine publicly, alongside her northern allies," Cassian said. "Proof that cannot be dismissed as court gossip or political maneuvering. Unfortunately, such proof has proven difficult to obtain. Seraphine is careful, and her allies operate from beyond our direct jurisdiction. An idea began forming in Elena's mind, one she suspected Draven would resist strongly once she voiced it aloud. What if I gave her a reason to act carelessly, she said slowly. If she believes I am becoming vulnerable, isolated, perhaps even doubting my place within the palace, she may grow bold enough to make a mistake we can use against her. Absolutely not, Draven said immediately, his voice sharp with an edge Elena rarely heard from him. I will not use you as bait for a woman who has already tried to poison you once. I am not suggesting reckless bait, Elena said patiently. I am suggesting careful strategy. If Seraphine believes I am struggling, perhaps considering leaving the palace altogether, she may attempt direct contact, believing she can convince me to abandon my place here voluntarily, rather than through further violence. That contact, if we prepare properly, could give us exactly the proof Cassian needs. Draven's jaw remained tight, clearly torn between his instinct to protect her entirely and his recognition that her reasoning held genuine merit. Cassian, watching the exchange with careful interest, finally spoke. Lady Elena's plan holds real possibility, Your Majesty, he said carefully. With sufficient guards positioned nearby, unseen but ready to act, the risk could be managed far more safely than the poisoning was able to be prevented. It took considerable persuasion, spread across several tense conversations over the following days, before Draven finally agreed, though he insisted on personally overseeing every detail of the arrangement, refusing to allow Elena out of close protection at any point during the plan's execution. Elena, for her part, appreciated his caution, even as she pushed back against his instinct to shield her from every possible danger, understanding that some risks were worth taking if they meant finally ending the threat hanging over both their futures. The plan began simply enough. Elena allowed herself to be seen at court, appearing withdrawn and uncertain, avoiding Draven's company more visibly than usual, spending long hours alone in the gardens where palace gossip could easily observe and report her apparent distress. Within days, exactly as predicted, a folded note appeared beneath her chamber door, unsigned, but written in an elegant, familiar hand. The garden fountain, after moonrise. Come alone if you wish to hear the truth about what awaits you here. Elena read the note twice, her heart pounding, despite the careful preparation that had gone into this exact moment. She carried it immediately to Draven, who read it with a grim expression before nodding slowly, already turning to instruct Cassian on the positioning of hidden guards throughout the garden. This is it, Draven said quietly, once the arrangements had been finalized. Whatever happens tonight, Elena, know that you will not be alone for a single moment, even if it appears otherwise. I trust you, Elena said simply, and she meant it completely, surprising herself with how naturally the words had come, how far she had traveled from the frightened woman who had once stood trembling before this same man in a firelit study, uncertain whether she would survive the night. As moonrise approached and Elena made her way toward the garden fountain alone, the palace around her fell into an unusual stillness, as though the entire structure were holding its breath alongside her, waiting to see whether tonight would finally bring the truth they had all been searching for into the light. The garden at night looked nothing like it did beneath the afternoon sun. Shadows pooled thick between the hedges, and the fountain's gentle splash seemed unnaturally loud in the silence surrounding it. Elena walked slowly along the stone path, her heart hammering despite the knowledge that Draven's guards were positioned somewhere just beyond her sight, close enough to reach her within seconds if anything went wrong. She reached the fountain and stopped, waiting, her hands clasped tightly in front of her to keep them from trembling. Several minutes passed with nothing but the sound of water and the distant call of a night bird somewhere beyond the garden walls. Just as she began to wonder whether the meeting had been called off entirely, a figure emerged from the shadows near the eastern hedge. I confess, I did not expect you to come alone, Seraphine said, stepping into the pale moonlight, her golden hair loose around her shoulders, in a way Elena had never seen at court, softer somehow, though her eyes remained as sharp and calculating as ever. I assumed the king would insist on guards surrounding you at all times, given recent events. I wanted to hear whatever you have to say without an audience, Elena replied carefully, keeping her voice steady. Your note suggested you had truths I needed to hear. Seraphine studied her for a long moment, something almost pitying in her expression. You do not belong here, Elena Marsh. Surely, somewhere beneath whatever affection Draven has convinced you to feel, you understand that. A seamstress cannot rule a kingdom. The nobles will never fully accept you, no matter how patiently Draven pretends otherwise. Is that truly why you asked me here? Elena asked. To convince me I am unworthy of a bond I did not choose, any more than Draven chose it. I asked you here, Seraphine said, her voice sharpening slightly, to offer you an opportunity. Leave the palace. Return to your shop, your ordinary life, before things grow far more dangerous than a single poisoned meal. I can arrange safe passage for you and your mother, resources enough to rebuild your business tenfold, more wealth than you could earn sewing royal robes for the rest of your life. And in exchange? In exchange, you simply disappear, Seraphine said, quietly, without scandal. Draven will grieve, perhaps, but he will recover, and the throne will finally return to stability, rather than remaining tangled in whatever foolish notion of fate brought the two of you together. Elena kept her expression carefully neutral, aware that Cassian's hidden observers needed clear, damning words, not vague implications easily denied later before the full court. You speak as though you have already arranged everything, she said. As though powerful allies stand ready to help you achieve whatever comes next, should I refuse your generous offer? Something flickered across Seraphine's face, a flash of pride she could not quite suppress. I have allies who understand the importance of a stable throne, she said. Allies who recognize that a king distracted by sentiment and fate makes poor decisions for his kingdom. They have been patient, Elena, but their patience is not endless. The Northern Pack, Elena said quietly, watching closely for Seraphine's reaction. The flicker of surprise that crossed Seraphine's face confirmed everything Cassian's investigators had suspected. You know more than I expected, she said slowly, her earlier composure beginning to crack at the edges. How much has Draven uncovered? Enough, Elena said, and before Seraphine could react further, dark shapes emerged swiftly from the surrounding hedges, guards moving with practiced precision to surround the noblewoman before she could attempt to flee. Draven himself stepped forward from the shadows near the fountain's edge, his expression cold and unforgiving, in a way Elena had never witnessed, directed at anyone else. Seraphine Ashgrove, he said, his voice carrying easily across the suddenly crowded garden. You stand accused of conspiring with agents of a foreign pack against the security of this crown, of orchestrating the poisoning of Lady Elena Marsh, and of attempting, only moments ago, to arrange her removal through bribery and threat. Do you deny these accusations? Seraphine's composure shattered entirely, her earlier confidence replaced by wide-eyed panic as she realized the full scope of what had just occurred. Draven, please, she said, her voice trembling now, all pretense of calculated control abandoned. You must understand, everything I did was to protect this kingdom from a mistake that would weaken us for generations. The Northern Pack promised stability, real alliances, not some foolish notion of fate tying you to a common seamstress. You attempted to murder an innocent woman, Draven said, his voice hard as stone. There is no justification you can offer that excuses that choice, regardless of what you believed you were protecting. Guards moved forward to restrain Seraphine, who continued protesting, even as they led her away, her voice growing fainter, as they escorted her toward the palace's secure holding chambers, far from the garden, where her carefully constructed plans had finally, decisively, come undone. Once she had disappeared from sight, the tension that had gripped the garden slowly began to ease, replaced by an exhausted stillness as Draven crossed quickly to where Elena stood, still trembling slightly from the encounter. You were magnificent, he said quietly, pulling her gently into his arms, his relief palpable in the way he held her, as though reassuring himself she remained unharmed. This is more than enough to expose the Northern Pack's involvement before the full court, alongside Seraphine's own confession. It is over then, Elena said, allowing herself finally to relax against him, the adrenaline of the past hour slowly beginning to fade. Not entirely, Draven admitted. There will be a trial, negotiations with the Northern Pack's leadership, consequences that will take time to fully resolve. But the immediate danger against you, Elena, I believe has finally been dealt with. She pulled back slightly to look up at him, searching his face in the moonlight, finding none of the cold arrogance that had first drawn her anger at the Unity Ball months ago, only warmth and relief, and something steadier still, growing quietly beneath both. Thank you, she said softly, for trusting my plan, even when every instinct told you to keep me locked away instead. It was the hardest thing I have done since becoming king, Draven admitted, a rare, genuine smile finally breaking through his exhaustion. I suspect it will not be the last time you convince me to set aside my instincts in favor of yours. No, Elena said, smiling back at him, despite everything they had just endured. I suspect it will not be. News of Seraphine's arrest spread through the palace by dawn, and by midday, it had traveled across the surrounding towns with the same speed her earlier humiliation of Elena had once carried through the court. This time, however, the whispers carried a very different tone, no longer questioning why a common seamstress had been permitted to remain within the palace walls, but instead, marveling at the courage it must have taken to walk alone into that garden, knowing full well what danger awaited her there. Elena found the sudden shift in attention almost harder to bear than the earlier suspicion had been. Servants who had once regarded her with quiet skepticism now offered nervous, respectful nods whenever she passed. Nobles who had previously ignored her entirely at court gatherings suddenly seemed eager to exchange pleasant words, their earlier disdain replaced by careful, calculating politeness that Elena recognized immediately for what it was. They do not respect me any more than they did before, she said to Draven one evening, as they walked together through the palace's private wing, following a long day of preparations for Seraphine's formal trial. They simply fear offending whoever might end up standing beside the throne. Perhaps, Draven admitted, though I suspect genuine respect will follow, in time, once they see you continue proving them wrong about what you are capable of. The trial itself, when it finally convened before the full royal court 3 weeks later, proved as complicated as Cassian had warned it might be. Seraphine, stripped of the composed elegance that had once defined her presence at court, stood before the assembled nobility, with her head held high, despite the shackles at her wrists, refusing, until the very end, to fully express remorse for her actions. Everything I did, she said, her voice carrying clearly through the silent hall, was in service of this kingdom's future. A king, bound by fate, to a woman with no standing, no political value, weakens every alliance this crown depends upon. I acted to protect what I believed was right, even if the court now condemns me for it. You conspired with agents of a foreign pack against the security of this throne, Draven said from his place upon the raised dais, his voice steady and unwavering, despite the years of history he clearly shared with the woman standing accused before him. You arranged the poisoning of an innocent woman, and when that failed, you attempted bribery and coercion to remove her by other means. Whatever justification you offer yourself, Seraphine, the law does not recognize ambition as an excuse for treason. The verdict, when it finally came, stripped House Ashgrove of its noble standing and exiled Seraphine from the kingdom's borders permanently, a punishment considered merciful by many, given the severity of her crimes, though harsh enough to send a clear message across every remaining noble house watching the proceedings unfold. The Northern Pack's involvement, once fully exposed through Cassian's careful investigation, led to swift diplomatic consequences as well. Their trading privileges revoked entirely, their leadership forced into humiliating negotiations to avoid outright conflict with the crown. By the time the trial concluded and the court slowly began returning to its usual rhythms, something fundamental had shifted within the palace walls, a recognition, quiet but unmistakable, that Elena Marsh was no longer simply a curiosity tolerated at the king's side, but a woman who had proven, through courage and quick thinking, that she belonged there as much as anyone born into noble privilege ever could. You have earned quite a reputation, Cassian told her one afternoon, finding her in the sewing rooms where she had returned to her work despite no longer needing the income it once provided. Half the court now speaks of you, as though you invented the concept of courage yourself. I simply refuse to be frightened away, Elena said, smiling slightly as she continued her careful stitching, though I admit, I did not expect any of this when I first agreed to attend that ball. Few of us ever expect the paths our lives eventually take, Cassian said thoughtfully. Though I confess, watching the king these past months, I have not seen him this settled since long before his father's passing. Whatever fate arranged between the two of you, it has been good for him, Elena, beyond even the political benefits it has brought this kingdom. The observation stayed with her long after Cassian had departed, settling warmly in her chest as she considered how far she had traveled since that first humiliating encounter at the Unity Ball. From a frightened seamstress convinced she would be executed for striking a stranger, to a woman who had helped expose a conspiracy threatening the very stability of the throne itself. That evening, Draven found her in the garden, standing near the same fountain where Seraphine's plans had finally unraveled weeks earlier. He approached quietly, settling beside her without speaking at first, simply enjoying the peaceful stillness that had finally returned to the space after the tension of recent months. "I have been thinking," he said finally, breaking the comfortable silence between them, "about what comes next for us, now that the immediate danger has passed." Elena turned to look at him, sensing something significant in the careful way he had chosen his words. "What are you thinking?" "I am thinking," Draven said slowly, reaching for her hand, "that I have waited long enough, out of caution and fear of moving too quickly, to properly claim what fate offered me, the moment I first saw you across that crowded ballroom. I am thinking that the kingdom, and perhaps more importantly, my own heart, is ready for a queen." Elena's breath caught slightly at the weight of what he was suggesting, though she found, searching her own feelings carefully, that the answer had already settled firmly within her weeks ago. Somewhere between the fear of that poisoned dinner and the quiet courage of walking alone into a garden trap to expose a conspiracy against the crown she had somehow, against every expectation, come to genuinely care about protecting. "I think," she said softly, "that I am ready as well." The smile that broke across Draven's face in response was unlike anything she had seen from him before, unguarded and genuinely joyful, the last remaining traces of the cold, arrogant stranger from that first ball, finally, completely replaced by the man he had grown into over these past difficult months, a man Elena realized she had come, somewhere along this unexpected journey, to love completely. Word of the upcoming coronation spread through the kingdom faster than any royal announcement in recent memory, carried by messengers to every pack and territory within Draven's realm, and beyond it, to neighboring kingdoms curious about the seamstress who had somehow captured the notoriously guarded king's heart. Preparations began almost immediately, transforming the palace into a hive of activity, unlike anything Elena had witnessed since her arrival months earlier. She found herself, somewhat ironically, at the center of an enormous effort to design her own coronation gown, surrounded by the very seamstresses she had once worked alongside as an equal, now deferring to her opinion on every detail, with a mixture of excitement and lingering disbelief, that the quiet, hard-working woman they had come to know was about to become their queen. "You should let us handle the majority of the stitching, Your Grace," said Marta, the head seamstress who had initially been skeptical of Elena's arrival, but had grown into a genuine friend over the preceding months. It would look strange for the future queen to arrive at her own coronation with needle marks on her fingers. "I intend to add at least a few stitches myself," Elena said firmly, though she smiled at the concern behind Marta's suggestion. "This gown will represent who I am becoming, not simply who the court expects me to be. I refuse to abandon the skills that brought me here in the first place." In the end, they compromised, with Elena personally sewing the delicate silver embroidery along the gown's collar, a deliberate echo of the beaded blue dress she had worn to the Unity Ball all those months ago, the dress Draven had once cruelly mocked, before recognizing, however reluctantly, that it represented far more skill and dedication than anything the court's finest tailors could produce. Not every aspect of the preparations proceeded smoothly. Several noble houses, though publicly supportive following Seraphine's dramatic downfall, privately expressed doubts about a common seamstress ascending to the throne, doubts that occasionally surfaced in pointed questions, during formal gatherings, or subtle exclusions from certain planning discussions Elena would once have been expected to lead. "They will accept you fully in time," Draven assured her one evening, finding her frustrated, after a particularly tense meeting with the council overseeing coronation logistics. "Change of this magnitude rarely happens without resistance, Elena, regardless of how thoroughly you have already proven yourself." "I know," Elena said, though the frustration remained evident in her voice. "I simply grow weary of proving myself again and again to people who have never once had to justify their own place within these walls." "Then let them watch you rule," Draven said simply. "Actions will convince them far more thoroughly than any words either of us might offer in argument." His confidence in her proved well placed. Over the following weeks, as coronation preparations continued, Elena took it upon herself to address several long-standing concerns among the kingdom's lower-ranked packs, communities much like the one she had grown up within, communities that had often felt overlooked by a court more concerned with noble alliances than the daily struggles of ordinary families. She proposed, with Draven's full support, a series of reforms aimed at expanding trade opportunities for smaller packs, initiatives that quickly earned genuine, widespread support among common citizens, even as they slowly won over skeptical nobles who recognized the practical wisdom behind her suggestions. "You continue to surprise me," Cassian remarked one afternoon, reviewing the details of her proposed reforms with obvious approval. "Most nobility raised within these walls would never think to consider the perspective you bring so naturally." "I spent my entire life within a small pack, watching my mother struggle to keep our shop running through difficult winters," Elena said. "It would be a waste of everything I learned growing up if I abandoned that understanding, simply because I now wear finer clothing." As the coronation day finally approached, Elena found herself standing once more before a tall mirror, much as she had on the night of the Unity Ball all those months earlier, though everything about the moment felt profoundly different this time. Instead of the simple blue dress she had sewn alone by candlelight, she wore a gown of deep silver and blue silk, the fabric flowing like moonlight itself, the collar embroidered with her own careful stitching, alongside the palace's finest craftsmanship. Her mother, who had traveled to the palace for the occasion, stood beside her, tears gathering in her eyes as she studied her daughter's reflection. "I never imagined this," she said softly. "Not in my wildest dreams, watching you struggle through those difficult years, did I imagine my daughter would become queen of this entire kingdom." "Neither did I," Elena admitted, smiling despite the nervous flutter building steadily in her chest. "Sometimes I still wonder if I dreamed the entire encounter at that ball. The slap, the chaos, everything that followed." "Whatever strange path brought you here," her mother said, embracing her carefully to avoid disturbing the elaborate gown, "I have never been prouder of the woman you have become." A soft knock interrupted the tender moment, followed by Cassian's familiar voice, announcing that the ceremony was ready to begin. Elena took a final steadying breath, meeting her own reflection one last time, before turning to follow her mother from the chamber, toward the grand hall, where the entire kingdom's future awaited her arrival. The grand hall had been transformed entirely for the occasion, its usual formal coldness replaced by warmth and light, banners in silver and deep blue hanging from every column, flowers imported from across the kingdom filling the air with soft, sweet fragrance. Every noble house had gathered, alongside representatives from packs both great and small, all eyes fixed upon the raised dais where Draven stood waiting, dressed in ceremonial robes that caught the candlelight with each small movement. Elena walked the long aisle slowly, her mother having taken her seat among the honored guests moments earlier, leaving Elena to complete this final walk alone, much as she had once walked alone into a dangerous garden weeks before, though this time, fear had been entirely replaced by quiet, steady joy. She was aware of every eye upon her, the same court that had once whispered doubts about her worthiness, now watching in respectful, hushed anticipation, and she found, to her own quiet satisfaction, that their judgment no longer held the power over her it once had. Draven's expression, as she approached the dais, softened into something unguarded and openly affectionate, a far cry from the cold arrogance he had once worn like armor at that fateful Unity Ball. He extended his hand as she reached the final steps, helping her ascend to stand beside him before the assembled court, the weight of the moment settling over the entire hall like a held breath. The high priestess, an elderly wolf named Old Mira who had presided over royal ceremonies for generations, stepped forward with the ceremonial crown resting upon a cushion of deep blue velvet, her voice carrying clearly through the silent hall as she began the traditional words that would formally bind Elena to the throne beside Draven. "Elena Marsh," she said, "do you accept the responsibility of this crown, to serve not only the king beside you, but every soul within this kingdom's borders, regardless of standing or birth, with fairness, courage, and unwavering dedication?" "I do," Elena said, her voice steady and clear, carrying easily to every corner of the crowded hall. "And do you, King Draven, accept Elena Marsh, not merely as your fated mate, but as your equal partner in the governance and protection of this realm, trusting her judgment and wisdom as thoroughly as your own?" "I do," Draven said, his eyes never leaving Elena's face, without hesitation or reservation. Old Mira lifted the crown from its velvet cushion, a delicate circlet of silver, woven with small blue stones, that caught the light like captured starlight, and placed it gently upon Elena's dark hair. The moment it settled into place, a wave of applause swept through the hall. Genuine and enthusiastic, nobles and common representatives alike rising to their feet in recognition of the new queen standing before them. Draven turned to face her fully, once the ceremonial words had concluded, his expression carrying a warmth that seemed to encompass everything they had endured together over the past months. The humiliation of that first encounter, the fear of the poisoning, the courage it had taken to face Seraphine alone in that moonlit garden, and finally, this moment of quiet triumph neither of them could have fully imagined when their story first began. "Do you remember," he said quietly, leaning close enough that only she could hear his words over the continuing applause, "what you told me, that very first night, when I asked if you understood the consequences of striking a king?" "I told you I would slap you again if you repeated your insults," Elena said, smiling, despite the formality of the moment surrounding them. "You did," Draven agreed, the corner of his mouth curving into the same rare, genuine smile that had first surprised her all those months ago in that firelit study. "I believe, all things considered, that slap remains the single best decision either of us made that entire evening." "I still think you deserved it," Elena said softly. "I did," Draven admitted, laughing quietly despite the solemn occasion surrounding them. "And I suspect, whatever challenges await this kingdom in the years ahead, I will continue deserving your honesty far more than I deserve your patience with me. Fortunately for you," Elena said, "I seem to have an abundance of both." As the ceremony concluded and the celebration began in earnest, filling the grand hall with music and laughter long into the night, Elena found herself standing beside Draven, near one of the tall windows overlooking the palace gardens, the same gardens where danger had once threatened everything they were building together, now bathed peacefully in moonlight below. "The kingdom seems to have accepted you fully," Draven observed, watching the joyful celebration continuing behind them. "They have accepted the story," Elena corrected gently. "The rest, I suspect, I will need to continue earning, day by day, decision by decision, for as long as I hold this crown." "A wise queen already," Draven said, pulling her gently closer, understanding that a crown is earned continuously, never simply granted once and forgotten. Elena leaned into him, watching the moonlight play across the gardens below, thinking back over the impossible journey that had brought her from a struggling seamstress's shop to this exact moment, standing beside the king she had once struck in anger, now bound to him not merely by fate, but by genuine, hard-earned love and mutual respect. Whatever challenges the future held, whether from foreign pacts still resentful of their defeated ambitions, or noble houses slow to fully embrace a queen born outside their privileged circles, Elena felt, standing there in the quiet aftermath of her coronation, a deep and settled confidence that she and Draven would face them together, exactly as they had faced every danger since that unforgettable night at the Unity Ball, when an arrogant stranger's cruel words had earned him a slap he would spend the rest of his life grateful to have received. The music continued softly behind them, the celebration stretching long into the night, but for that quiet moment by the window, the newly crowned Queen Elena and King Draven simply stood together, watching the moonlit gardens below, finally, completely at peace with the extraordinary path that had led them both exactly where they were always meant to be.